So my name is Michael Moon, and I am currently an associate adjunct at Columbia University, and picked back up the company I started a couple of years ago called Accelerate Research and Advisory Services. I'm actually technically in between jobs, but I am a people analytics practitioner. I am an IO psychologist, but I like to think of myself as a hybrid HR tech, analytics, and IO psychologist. So I live in all of these worlds, have a foot in each of them, which allows me to apply a unique lens to how I look at people analytics.
Cool. All right. Well, I'll get out of your way and let you have at it.
All right, great.
Enjoy.
And I apologize to the audience. I had a webcam set up that was like here so I could look straight on, but that webcam isn't working. So if I'm not looking at you, it's because I'm looking up here at my monitor. So I apologize. But hopefully the content will be more important than watching my face. So what I find really interesting about what I'm about to present right now is I've been on all the sessions since 7 o'clock this morning, and there's so much synergy. It's like I'm like you could hear me in the background going, yes, yes, exactly. So hopefully you'll hear some of that synergy if you've been on throughout the day. But I do want to kind of set the stage for my talk today. With the rest of the world, we have been watching in disbelief as COVID-19 has taken hold. As a pandemic. It's really changed the way our life is, right? As a result of that, we've also seen the speed and scale of change continue to accelerate. And we've seen technological advances bringing bigger and bolder changes in shorter windows of time, serving as a catalyst that's forcing organizations to speed up their future of work efforts. It's also forced them to think about the way to shift the way that we think about workers, and have no choice but to embrace initiatives that really help to promote the well-being and safety of the entire workforce. Adding to this crisis around the globe has become more keenly aware that there's more than one pandemic affecting lives and local economies right now, especially in the United States. On May 26th, the world watched in horror as the news of the brutal killing of George Floyd and an unarmed Black man streamed across our TV devices. Research shows that how organizations respond to large-scale diversity-related events, especially those that get widespread media coverage, can either help employees feel psychologically safe or contribute to racial identity threat and their mistrust in institutions. So the challenge that many organizations face today reach far beyond the marginalization of underrepresented employees in the workplace, and this means that conventional approaches to DE&I are simply not going to cut it. This is also very similar to what we heard from several speakers earlier today. And I'll go into a little bit more detail, both in how both of these crises have impacted people analytics. So I really want to talk about today, I'm going to talk about Nowsight, which is a concept that I came up with, but it's nothing unique. But it explained why this is needed now more than ever based on the global and local events that I just kind of highlighted. I'm also going to spend some time specifically talking about how COVID-19 is sparking a new focus for people analytics. Not a new focus, but maybe a renewed focus and emphasis. And highlight, the how social capital is an imperative focus for organizations now more than ever. And lastly, I want to finish up with this idea that we really need to think about how we both define and measure some of the primary constructs that are really, really bubbling to the surface as importance inside of organizations, especially as we start to see HR technology vendors and people analytics vendors try and meet these needs with a growing work from home workforce. So I'm sure we all in the people analytics community or even in HR have seen some form of what I'm about to talk to you about. When we think about kind of people analytics models and maturity around using data, we talk about hindsight, right? So using data to kind of look back in the back mirror, a rearview mirror, to help us understand what happened. When did it happen? Where did it happen? So it's really kind of looking backward, but using that historical data, we can help derive insight. So to better understand potentially why it happened. How does X relate to Y? what might need to happen, right? What should we be doing differently? And then we see, obviously, the end of this model, most of the models out there is about foresight. What might happen in the future? When might it happen? So the predictive analytics, the probability models, right? But what I really think we as orgs are faced to respond to the crises like COVID and the demonstrations of racial injustice, employee experience is going to be impacted. This also means that the role that people analytics plays has to change as well. And people analytics has to do more than just look at the past and generate insights on why things might have happened or may happen in the future, and stop to pay attention to the now, or what I call Nowsight. So we need to stop, slow down, and start to think about what is happening to our workers right now. How are they thinking and feeling right now? I really, this resonated with me earlier when Amit talked about, the feelings, right? We need to really think about feelings. And again, that was one of those cheerleader moments, like, yes, so I'm so on board, right? And one would argue, yeah, we should be doing this already. But right now, we just have no choice because we have to really meet the employees where they're at, based on what is happening around the world, in our local communities. So we also as part of that, we've seen, this is a similar model we'll see probably in another presentation. And I'd like to take about kind of the three areas in which people analytics has had to kind of stop what they were doing and really start to have contributions in a way to help respond, reimagine, re-engage in the workforce as a result of things like COVID and the racial injustices. So as organizations tried to quickly respond and react to the growing impact of COVID-19 on both their workers and their organization, there was an immediate need for them to take stock of how best to react to the pandemic, and HR leaders needed to be able to produce data on the current state of the workforce. So here are some examples of ways in which organizations have had to stop what they're doing to really just take an assessment of, where are my people, right? Are they located in higher risk areas? Do they all have employee emergency contact information? Right? All things we probably should have known before, but were incredibly important so that organizations could be agile and respond to how the pandemic was impacting workers all across the globe. And then as organizations prepare to have or have already started having their workers return to work, we need to actually apply a data-driven approach to better understand workers' unique attributes, needs, and dimensions, and be able to segment the workforce accordingly. And we heard from the folks from Workday that talked about the intersectionality. I'm going to talk a little bit about that when we get to diversity. But the real value in people analytics, I've always said, isn't how you segment the data. It's not about that number at the top. So people analytics, these are some of the ways in which people analytics need to start to just really emphasize and focus a lot of their efforts on. So what if and scenario planning, we heard that also from some other speakers. So being able to come up with what if analysis and contingency planning to help determine who to bring back, when, and how to optimize the headcount to meet the frenetic pace of change that show no signs of stopping anytime soon. How do we optimize headcount to meet the high level of uncertainty? At the same time, more than ever, we also need to focus on the employees and their health. We have to help our organizations understand how workers are feeling, how are they doing, approaching workforce planning with empathy and carefully considering collecting data on both who can and should return to work, as well as who wants to return to work. We have to look at how the different personas and being able to measure, not only people analytics being able to measure what, am I a simple survey, 2-question survey. Are you able to return to work? Yes, no. Do you want to return to work? Yes, no. If you're not able to return to work, why? If you are, so asking those questions will then help organizations better be able to craft policies and guidance uniquely to the people in their own organization. At the same time, we have to also help organizations understand things like how remote work affects the employee morale, burnout, productivity. of our workforce, or how the impact of distractions and collaboration overload and affect employee engagement and turnover, which we're going to talk about towards the latter end of the presentation. So if organizations can better understand their workers, they will be able to be more effective and create more targeted programs. And lastly, the area where people analytics I get the most excited about is as we think about how do we reimagine or reinvent the workplace. So, and some of these are things we're already doing, but again, it's the elevating of the importance. So continuous listening through survey attestations and real-time responses, ensuring that employees and their families are healthy and safe, while providing the support they need to manage the effects of the pandemic should be the top priority. How people are connected. Actually, I'm going to skip ahead. There we go. How people are connected. I'll come back to the recombine, but how people are connected, why they are connecting. Organizational network analysis is going to play a very key role here and will be a very strong emphasis when I get to sections on diversity and inclusion. Speaking of diversity, right, it's an opportunity for us to capitalize on diversity. What I mean by that, and I'll briefly talk to my position on the difference between diversity and inclusion and what diversity really means. And that means being able to utilize the diversity in a way that it actually helps support and allow empower those who are marginalized or underrepresented. How do we actually use that diversity for good rather than simply counting people and putting them in buckets? Also talk about how to think about how we rethinking productivity and some of the ways in which technology vendors, some are doing it the right way. Some of them are, repackaging themselves, and we'll talk about that, and saying, yep, we measure productivity. And we'll talk about why that's just not the way we should be looking at our workers, especially not just because of the pandemic and everything else that's going on in the world, but especially because we're a knowledge economy, right? We're not a manufacturing economy, so we'll talk about that. All right. For those of you that know me, I'm very passionate about the construct of social capital. I've been doing ONA or talking about ONA back when, if you said ONA, people thought you had 18 heads, which at that time, people analytics, I only had 6 heads, but ONA was like, that's futuristic from another planet. But I truly believe that at the heart of every organization is social capital. And at the crux of social capital is the trust that exists inside that organization. It's trust in the organization, it's trust in leaders, it's trust in managers, it's trust in your peers. And it's the norms of reciprocity that exist inside of the organization as a result of that trust. So when I think about what's happening, right, I'm grabbing some data points here. I'm just going to build the slide ahead. But think about, we know that there's increases in work from home. I looked at 2 Gallup studies, and roughly a 700% increase in the number of employees working from home, which is, should be no surprise to anyone. And then, we're also seeing from a study from Worklytics, the number of hours working is 15%. I didn't even need to see this study to know that that's my life, right? And then, part of that is that we're in more meetings, right? So the pandemic has put more hours in the working day. It's creating exhaustion and burnout, and simultaneously exposing stress that many workers face in balancing their professional and personal demands, and increases in personal commitments and roles, such as having to be a parent or a caregiver or a teacher, right? While you're also trying to manage your professional life. So, as I talked earlier, digital transformation has really accelerated. It's massively accelerated due to the global pandemic. But we also know that leaders are really worried about organizational stability, as well as their ability to remain profitable, and for how work from home is actually going to impact productivity. Interestingly, at the same time, if we take a look, I'm going to build this here. So I did a quick little analysis of Google searches, and EMS stands for Employee Monitoring Software. And so what I saw was there was like this identical spike in people across the globe searching for the term employee monitoring software and searching for productivity. Now, obviously, I don't know if they're the same people, but the spikes seem to correlate, right? So we saw an influx of those searches starting in kind of early March. And then again, so that's the beginning of the pandemic, or, when we're starting to really take notice, especially in the United States, but overall, right? And then we move to August, which is where we start seeing more people being called back to the workplace. You've got schools opening up, so you're starting to get some semblance of normalcy back. Right. But as a result of this, what this has signaled to me, and also in doing a survey of kind of looking at all of the technology, a lot of the vendors in the space, and it's a wide spectrum, and I have a whole nother talk I can talk about what that is and how I kind of look at those types of software. But you're starting to see vendors who were, 2-3 months ago were employee surveillance systems. Now they're productivity trackers, right? And what the use of this technology is doing is signaling to employees that we don't trust them, right? And this is having a very negative impact on employees. And if that wasn't bad enough, many other vendors are not actually measuring things the right way, or even things that really matter. And so we're going to talk about productivity and collaboration first, and then I'm going to transition over into talking about diversity and inclusion and the role that people analytics function has to play right now. So from a productivity standpoint, again, we are no longer, a manufacturing and, kind of world, right? But what we still see is that many of these vendors are focusing primarily on quantity of time. So how much time do I spend in meetings, or how much time do I spend in that application? And using that as a way to simply say, look, if they're spending more time here, then they must be productive, right? And what that does is give employers this false sense of complacency. It kind of lulls you into the sense of complacency that, oh, look, we're able to see they're being productive. But it's not truly measuring productivity. What we should be doing is emphasizing the quality of the output. So if we think about quantity, right, let's say, even if we talk about quantity in general and not just quantity of time, let's say I work in a toy factory, and I am able to produce 100 toys that day, and I get them all in my 12-hour shift, and but none of them work. Does it really matter that I produced 100 toys? Not really, right? Because of the waste, the time, right? We need to shift how we're thinking about measuring the impact that people have on the organization. We also need to think about how networks affect pockets of productivity. So especially now that we're working remotely, and we heard from earlier presenters about the need for connections, but also we'll talk in a second about how you can have too many connections, right? And then maybe start to think about measuring productivity in terms of kind of using human capital financial metrics as proxies for productivity. So things like revenue per FTE, or human capital investment, return on investment. Okay. Additionally, a lot of the vendors may be talking about increases in collaboration. We can see that you interact with more people. Although I do like the earlier example. So in this case, from TrustView, right? It's not so much about how many more people you interact with, but that you interact with people who are from different places than you normally would interact, or with whom you never had connections before. That's slightly different. But much of what we're seeing is this emphasis on really what we're doing is measuring communication, not collaboration. And measuring digital exhaust, right? Like how many meetings I'm in, how many IMs I am part of, how many phone calls, doesn't really tell us what we need to know. And again, we go back to this quality, right? So just because I'm in a meeting with my best friend in the world, Mary, I'm in like lots of meetings with her, doesn't mean that we are producing anything or we're being collaborative. Right? It could just simply mean we're really good friends. We really like hanging out with each other, right? Or it could be that we're good friends, but we're terrible, at business, and we never seem to really get to a conclusion. So we have to keep meeting over and over and over again. So again, these measures don't help us understand really what's happening at the heart of collaboration. And lastly, we really need to be shifting away from, even from a productivity standpoint, thinking more about emphasizing measurement at the team level, or the intra or inter level, and not just on individuals. So vendors that are producing these singular productivity scores and then sharing them out definitely we need to be aware of those. So let me move on to diversity inclusion. I'm going to spend the remainder of the presentation talking about these two. But I mentioned earlier that I was going to talk about how I think about the differences between the two, right? So with diversity, this really represents the similarities and the differences above both individual and organizational characteristics that shape the workplace. And they include more than just the commonly considered traits of age, gender, ethnicity, race. And now is the time for us to really start to expand to include things such as neurodiversity, areas of study, even things like tenure or industry or experience, right? How did those impact? And tracking diversity is actually going to give organizations the data that they need to make strategic decisions and help to support underrepresented groups in the workplace. However, simply having a diverse workforce isn't enough. Right? So now we move over to inclusion, and inclusion is, by my definition, is a means by which the organization optimizes the benefits of having a diverse workforce, one in which they welcome and support diversity, and where they have deliberate actions that include the removal of obstacles, but the actions that are aimed at creating a workplace culture where all differences are welcomed, accepted, and appreciated, and where special attention is paid to unrepresented groups. These groups, more than others, need to feel like they have a voice, are included in decision making, and believe that they can be their authentic selves in the workplace. Let's talk about now ways in which analytics can actually help organizations to be deliberate in the way in which diversity is leveraged as a valued resource to facilitate higher levels of inclusion. So I'm going to start just with diversity, and then we'll move over to inclusion. So I've broken this up into three kind of areas. So we think about, traditionally we do think about diversity in terms of composition, makeup, right? But so again, I go back to the workday, and literally my notes say here, we need to add a focus on intersectionality of gender, race, and ethnicity. So I use a chart on the right. So I do some dummy data, right? If we just looked at percentages, right, we would see that, well, there's not that big of a difference between gender, gender percentage, race and ethnicity percentage, great, but when we actually segment that out and we actually break out the race and ethnicity and overlay that with gender, we actually can see those areas that I have kind of in the square boxes, there are large differences, right? It's that segmentation by looking at the intersectionality and segmenting the data, that is where we really need to be focusing our efforts as people analytics professionals. We also need to stop, and I'm just going to be very firm, we need to stop just reporting out percentage diversity. We need to think about how diversity is actually, how the differences in the makeup, right? Actually, is that actually statistically significant? So a little nerdy here. So moving beyond generic percentage comparisons, using statistics such as chi-square and the eta squared significance statistics. So the conclusions that we make about the differences between different populations don't merely rely on those percentage comparisons. And then we have to start thinking about not just statically the numbers, but how do we measure the flow of diverse talent? So I like this chart here from a recent McKinsey report. Actually, I think this is the Women in Workplace report. Yeah. So from leanin.org. But this idea, of being able to look at the pipeline and see how diversity is used throughout the organization. So through the hiring process, through the promotion process. In this case, this example of kind of looking at it by leadership level. So really, it's not just about having the diverse talent, but how are you utilizing that and how are you moving those people through the organization? And then really focusing on using data to help mitigate bias. So whether that's analyzing people processes to identify potential biases. So for example, we could look at the employee referral process, right? If we want to do some analysis and try and look at, what we call the homophily or the just like me syndrome. We could do analysis and try and see, of how many times, a candidate was selected based on similar characteristics of the hiring panel, right? And if we can look at that, but we also know that from an employee referrals perspective, right, we tend to recommend people similar to ourselves, right? So if we already have a problem in diversity inside the organization, what we're doing is perpetuating it, right? So we have to do more around that. Then there are just job description text analysis. There's a great vendor that does this, but are we thinking about, as we're designing our job descriptions or our job postings, are all those requirements really needed? Right. What we do know is from research is that women are more likely to apply for a job when they meet all the criteria or most of the criteria, whereas men are more likely to apply when they meet maybe half. Right. So it's definitely significantly less. So rethinking, reanalyzing those job postings, and this should say job posting, not job description, but which we're pulling the description from to post if we're doing it right. And then lastly, we heard earlier from a couple of presenters as well, this concept of nudging, right? So nudging, I like to call to promote conscious inclusion. So moving away from formalized training on unconscious bias, but how do we embed nudges around maybe including people from different backgrounds, right, as part of a process or part of a team, or as you're storming to come up with an idea, getting these little nudges or emails or maybe messages on your mobile device, right, targeted to you based on certain things. And then network analysis. I'm only going to touch on a couple of the use cases. There's tons more, and I know we've heard from other presenters, and we're going to continue to hear from others later. But we can talk about, how identifying hidden talent, right? How do we locate diverse talent that may have high social capital, but that we wouldn't necessarily know if we hadn't done network analysis? Right? Measuring the impact of networks on key business outcomes. So using network analysis or network diagrams to actually visualize the level of heterogeneity in organizations. So that's the mix of people, right? And how that level, either in the organization, so at the macro level, the meso level, or the micro level, or even at the team level, and then correlating those network measures with organizational and business outcomes, like perhaps productivity, right? One of my favorite examples is innovation, right? What we do know from research is that innovation is fed by creativity. And when you bring together what people from different backgrounds, experiences, education, age, you name it, what you do is help create something naturally called creative discord. And so when there was a research study done by Salvatore Parisi out of Adamsen College about maybe 10 years ago, where he just looked at Twitter networks of individuals inside of actually EMC, and different measures of innovation, and he was able to demonstrate that those individuals who had more open networks on Twitter were actually had more levels of innovation, especially around process innovation and product innovation. And then lastly, there are ways in which we can actually start to understand and describe behavior based on looking at networks. So understanding gender differences in how individuals networks, right? We know that women tend to be more broader and go a little bit more deeper in how they network, whereas men are much more about upward networking. But being able to identify, I've got a graphic here of breaking out a network, a decision-making network. This is from Heidrick and Struggles report, and looking at men and women, right, and seeing how women were not included in decision-making. If we go back to the way I've defined inclusion, or the way I've just decided to share how inclusion is defined, it's about feeling included, feeling like you're a part of, but being able to actually participate in decision-making. Right. So, by being able to visualize how women sit in certain types of networks, we can find ways to potentially intervene and make changes over time. And then inclusion. We'll talk about some inclusion analytics. We're breaking this up into affective measures and quantitative measures. So affective meaning more qualitative in nature, but we can start to look at how measuring inclusion using surveys, right? So we already know there's tons of vendors, there's tons of surveys out there. The 4 primary areas that we would be measuring are voice, equity, belonging, and decision making, and that using active forms of data collection. And then sentiment analysis, right, which we heard from Red Thread Research. This is an area where vendors can play a considerably larger role going forward. But the idea of being able to actually mine data, either from IMs or from the metadata emails, right, to better understand how people are feeling and thinking is an area in which people analytics can definitely help play a role. And if we move on to then I've got one more on this one. Actually, two more. We can start to look at, for example, burnouts. So if we look at, there's a concept that's called representation burnout, where an individual who might be of a minority group or an underrepresented group is constantly having to kind of stand up for what they believe in and identify areas where they're not being included, which can cause what's called representation burnout. So feelings of exhaustion that come from being the only person of a particular identity in an environment, and the othering, as it's called, that can occur as a result. And then quantitative measures, and I'm going to focus primarily on network analysis, because technically, the effective measurement, it's qualitative data collected in a quantitative way, but I want to talk about quantitative measurement using network analysis. So we can use it to help identify these marginalized or isolated groups of individuals. For example, we could look at the number of ties. So we can look at those who have low ego network density or low betweenness centrality. We can start to look at different networks and compare network density of different genders, race, ethnicity, you name it, right? Also identify unconscious network practices. So this one also is a similar, I just use this as an example from Heidrich and Struggles, but so we could use a passive approach to network analysis. So that's where, we're not using an active survey, we're passively gathering data, again, from digital exhaust, right? And we can see who within the organization each employee says that they've reached out to make a decision, both formally and informally within the organization. And then analysis of that network can then help identify if one of those groups is being underutilized. So in your analysis, you might see that women at the mid-level have a dramatically lower in degree from senior leaders than equally or less experienced men, for example. We can also look at something called the EI index, or the measure of embeddedness. And this measure looks at the ratio of the difference between the number of external and internal ties an individual has to other parts of an organization as a percent of the overall ties the individual has. And so embeddedness is very closely related to belonging, which is a key component of inclusion. To summarize, I want to just build all these here for you. The real call to action here, and I haven't highlighted everything, but this focus on the now, really focusing on how people are thinking and feeling, spending time with qualitative and passive data, allowing the function to become more proactive and less reactive. Again, all things we tried to attain before, but are just not, they're not things we can wait to figure out or even get buy-in for. At this point, many organizations are recognizing that this is not a nice to have, it's a must have. We need to start to think about less silos, and that includes really bringing more interdisciplinary uses of the data. So if that means combining data from different systems, or it could mean combining traditional people analytics or demographic data with network data, people analytics really needs to help play a bigger role in bringing those sources of data together. Eliminating and mitigating bias is a huge role that we have to play. And people analytics, especially when it's accompanied by evidence-based approaches, can help diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging by identifying and potentially removing much of the bias that exists in decision-making, and that's with or without AI. And then lastly, I'm not going to talk about you don't need it. Well, ping me on Twitter and I'll tell you what I mean by you don't need a data scientist. But in the interest of time, I do want to finish up with what I think is probably one of the most important things I hope we take away from my presentation today is that social capital, not just human capital measures, are imperative. I've always said from the beginning of my interest in this space, that human capital is not the last competitive advantage. It is the social capital, right? You cannot replicate the connections that you have between people, the relationships. You can take somebody with very strong human capital, strong knowledge, KSAs, very high performer, and you could take them out of that organization and plop them in another organization over here, and they may not be as successful, right? So how people are connected, why they are connecting, should be a renewed emphasis of people analytics, as it is our collective wisdom that exceeds the sum of its parts. And wisdom comes when we are able to recognize and appreciate our differences, even more than our similarities, but also where we come to understand the value of treating each other fairly and equitably to create a more inclusive environment where everyone can flourish.
Michael, thank you so much. We're going to take a short break, and then we'll be back with Anthony Ferraris of Nordstrom. Thank you so much.
Thank you.